Hello, I'm Walker, and this is The Recap Episode, a podcast exploring the history of reality TV. In each episode of the podcast, I deep dive into the creation, filming, viewing, and reception of reality TV shows through the history of the genre to give you the real tea about reality TV. To start our journey through reality TV history, we're going back to the year 1973 to take a look at what many consider to be the very first true reality TV show. Before this, we had shows such as Candid Camera and many talent scouting shows, think the precursor to an American Idol or an X Factor, that showed real people. However, these people were performing something or had something that they were putting on show. And so it wasn't reality TV in the same way that we think of it today, where we're watching people supposedly live their real lives. As you can probably imagine, the very first reality television show had a significant impact on kind of the TV and media industry. But it's actually also very deeply entwined with a general history of TV broadcasting up until that point as well. So while the show that we're going to talk about in this episode aired in 1973, we're actually going to step back a couple years earlier and discuss a brief history of just public broadcasting and television. So in 1963, with the support of the Ford Foundation, which is one of those like philanthropic organizations that'll give money to such and such to, make some good for the public benefit, the National Education Television, or we'll just call it NET or NET, was created with a mandate to produce 5 hours per week of programming, primarily in the areas of cultural and public affairs. Later, in 1969, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting created PBS, the same PBS we know today, after which the Ford Foundation actually reduced its involvement in public television. NET was merged with a local station called WNDT-13, and together they became WNET-13. This merge resulted in the firing of a lot of the main personnel from NET, which, as I said before, were producing shows about cultural and public affairs. And so you can imagine that this merge threatened the kind of media that was being put on television. In the early 1970s, networks like ABC, NBC, and CBS were all in a race for audience ratings. And so educational television wasn't exactly everyone's priority. There was a producer working at NET by the name of Craig Gilbert, and he was a TV documentarian that had started working at NET after leaving CBS in 1964. He was the creator of some smaller documentary pieces that were focused on the people who make culture. That's what he liked to make TV about. And so you can think this is like folk musicians and artists, people that are actually, in our society and making things and make the things we talk about. In 1967, keep in mind this is before the merge, NET initiated a new policy, in the race for ratings, that demanded all of its staff producers, including Craig Gilbert, that they needed to start making blockbusters, essentially high-profile shows that would call attention to the work of NET, bring in the views, bring in the ratings, and bring in the money. Gilbert, who'd worked there for a couple years, proposed that he make a documentary about Margaret Mead, a very famous anthropologist, possibly one of the most famous of all time. She was planning on returning to New Guinea, where she had done some field work, and Gilbert was like, oh, that seems interesting and educational. Let's go make a documentary about it. And so, surprisingly, I thought it was surprisingly, Margaret Mead was extremely on board. She was very much excited to be the focus of a documentary. And so it was made. Gilbert and Mead became very close friends, which will come to fruition later. And in December of 1968, Gilbert's first feature-length documentary was broadcast on NET, titled Margaret Mead's New Guinea Journal. From here, Gilbert, has had success. The documentary did really well, and so he went on to produce another one a year later. Kind of the same idea. Let's find someone who makes culture or, exudes culture and let's just tell their story. And so in 1969, Gilbert produced his next documentary about an Irish novelist named Christy Brown. He, at this time, had to change his cinematographer for the documentary, and that's where he met the video and audio duo of Alan and Susan Raymond, who were married as well, who will come into play in the story later. And so the Raymonds and Gilbert created this documentary about Christy Brown. It was an extreme success, and apparently Gilbert won an Emmy for this documentary, although in all of my research I was never able to figure out when or for what. Was it like best documentary, directing, producing, etc., sound? I could never find out which awards he won this at and which award it was. But I have multiple sources that say he got an Emmy for it. So take that what you will. Post-merger, things weren't looking good working at the company. Like I said, a lot of NET employees had been fired. And additionally, Gilbert was recently divorced. And so the job wasn't looking good. The love life was looking bleaker. He didn't really have much going for him. At this point, and I read this in a piece written by Gilbert reflecting on the show of this episode, he said all he wanted to do was to get himself fired from NET so that he could get severance pay and move on, which that's just a whole mood. However, his boss, head of cultural affairs at NET, whose name is Curtis Davis, said he'd only fire him after he completed one last thing for him. Gilbert said, "Fine, I'll do whatever you want, but you have to fire me after this." Curtis wanted Gilbert to take the weekend to write up a proposal and an idea for his dream TV program. He had no restrictions, didn't have to worry about time or money or any opinions from higher-ups or the public or anything. He just wanted to know what Gilbert wanted to make the most. And so Gilbert, drinking all throughout the weekend, as one does in this situation, came up with the idea to record a typical American family because he sat at home drinking alone and he was going, what happened? What happened to my marriage? And not only his marriage, but he kind of reflected and realized that the marriages of many of his friends were also falling apart or had already fallen apart. And so Gilbert was thinking to himself, why is this happening? What's going on in America that's making it so hard for young couples to stay together? Why are families having such a difficult time right now? Thinking like a researcher, surprisingly, which, again, he was not, I'm assuming he picked up some good sociology skills from Margaret when he was developing that documentary. He really asked, what is going on here? Let's investigate. And so he said, what if we record just a typical American family just to see what's going on and use that to make some statement about American culture and families in the 70s. On Monday, he takes this idea in, shows it to Curtis. Curtis loves it. By Tuesday, it was approved for production, and by the end of the following week, someone somewhere had found some money to put towards producing this show. Turns out that the money for this show actually came from the cancellation of a different show in the public affairs department, which you can obviously guess made cultural affairs everyone's favorite people at the station. But he had everything he needed, kind of surprisingly. He definitely didn't think it would get approved at all, and it did. Not only just by his boss, but his boss's boss and someone else who has the ability to move money around. And so now, Gilbert just needed to find the family for this show. If you were in Gilbert's position now, you've just pitched this wild idea for a show, never been done before. Nothing of this type has ever even been considered. How would you find the family to put on the show? You only get one family, although at one point Gilbert wanted 3 families to be on the show. However, you only get one. How do you even approach trying to find the family? How big would the family be? What kind of dynamics would they have? Are you going to pick a poor family, a middle-class family, a working-class family, a rich family? Do you pick a white family or a black family? Do you pick a family of immigrants? What image of America are you trying to pick? I have alluded to the name of this show a little bit so far in this story. The show that Gilbert would eventually create was called An American Family. And Gilbert at this point was looking for, essentially, the American family. Because whichever family he chose was essentially going to be the representative for American families across the country. So he had to pick something he had to choose a family that was both sufficient for his show, but also one that he knew wouldn't get him in trouble. And he spoke about this in a piece that he wrote reflecting on the show. But you can imagine the sitcoms at the time, and even the sitcoms since then and now, show a very idealized family, right? You're going to have that, well, in the case of the Brady Bunch, more than 2.5 kids. But, everything is perfect. Everyone has their own little, conflicts and journeys they go on. But there is no major flaws with the families in sitcoms. They are very constructed to be idealized and perfect. Now, Gilbert knew he was not going to find that at all in real life because he knew that that's just not real life. He could see it in his own marriage. He could see it in his friends' marriages and families. And he'd worked in TV long enough to know what's real and what's fake, and how far TV does stray from the truth. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't just pick any old family, because if he just went out and found, the first family he could, probably wouldn't be received very well. So Gilbert decided to try to find a middle-class family, which this was the 1970s, so there at least was, a sense of the middle class back then, and now the middle class has largely been turned into the lower upper class. The inklings of that are there in the 70s. But he needed a middle class family, and so he started to look in California. Of course he did, right? That's where all TV comes from. Keep in mind, Craig Gilbert is actually from the East Coast. So you can imagine how well he was received when he started looking for this in California as an East Coaster coming to the West. But he also looked in California for two big reasons. Yes, it's where TV is made and where TV has come from. But he also knew the people out west would be a bit more open to his idea and how it needed to happen. Because he was saying, let's film a family for a whole year. Imagine your family being filmed for a whole year. The people in the West, he knew, at least would be a bit more open to that idea. So going to California to start his search for the family for his show was pretty ideal, both kind of symbolically and just in a practical sense. So Gilbert flew out to California, and he started his search in LA, as I'm sure anyone would. So starting in LA, he interviewed 25 potential families, but none of them were quite what he was looking for. So he moved up to Palo Alto, and the same thing happened there. He interviewed, I think, 20 families, and still didn't find what he was looking for. He kept moving on. He even contacted family therapists to help, which don't know how they were supposed to help, because I'm sure that is a breach of confidentiality if a family therapist was like, oh yeah, I know this family, they have some problems, go film them, and you can tell them I sent you. Not sure he was hoping to get there, or maybe we were just doing confidentiality different in 1971. Who knows? But every potential family that he had started to interview and started to work with just seemed to be missing something. And it's very much one of those situations where you're trying to find the perfect fit, and you can't really explain what's missing, but you know you'll find what you're looking for when you find it. So eventually, while back in New York and working with the company on the show, he's ready to give up. Someone informs him of the city of Santa Barbara. And so he does a little research, he looks into it, and he says, wow, this looks great. I guess we can try there. He is losing faith at this point because he's interviewed so many families, and he's starting to think that, okay, this is impossible. I need to go tell Curtis and everyone else at the company, don't give me this $600,000 to do this show. It's not working out. We've already wasted all this money flying me around and talking to families. This isn't going to work. But he says, Santa Barbara looks pretty good. There's a school there. There's, the community is diverse. Let's see what it has for us. And so Gilbert actually tells a very funny story in this reflection piece about how he came to meet the family that had become the focus of his show. And the story is so much better when Gilbert tells it versus other historians. They seem to just gloss over the details of the story, which I think are very important. While Gilbert is in Santa Barbara, he is set up on a date of sorts with a woman because he's just not having a good time. And so one of his pals has said, hey man, you just go find yourself a lady and have a good night. So Gilbert says, fine, who do you have for me? And Gilbert is set up with the editor for a women's column of the Santa Barbara News Press. I believe her name was Mary Every. He shows up to her house for this little get-together, this shindig, this meet-cute, this date. She's already drunk. He shows up, and she's already so many drinks in. So Gilbert says, great, this is going to be a great evening. Can't wait to see how this turns out. She, after getting some drinks into him, finally gets Gilbert to explain the show he wants to make and this project he's working on to her. He tells her all the ideas and all the trouble he's had so far. And Mary Every is enthralled. She thinks it's one of the best ideas she's ever heard. Not only that, but she also thinks she knows the family that would be perfect for the show. To which Gilbert was like, okay, we'll see if this is true. Why not? Mary calls up the family. The family agrees to have them come over the same night to meet. And Gilbert tells this is the best part of the story. Mary is still drunk. She's drank more since Gilbert showed up. Mary drives them to the house of the family. And Gilbert is, in his reflection, he's like, I was covered in sweat by the time we got there, and I still don't know how we made it alive. Finally, after some drinks from both of them, and Gilbert probably has actually sweated himself to sobriety at this point in the night, not only due to drunk driving escapades, but probably the nerves of meeting yet another family. They arrive at the house of the Loud family. And like I said previously, this is one of those situations where you don't quite know what you're looking for until you find it. That happened to Gilbert here. The Loud family was exactly the family he was looking for. They were perfect. TV historian Jeffrey Ruoff is quoted as saying, Bill and Pat Loud, who were the parents of the family, were an attractive, outgoing, affluent couple with 5 children of various ages. Bill owned his own company, and Pat raised the children in their spacious ranch-style home at 35 Wooddale Lane. Which, in case you're wondering, that home is still standing. I found it on Google Maps the other day. So, if you're ever in Santa Barbara and you want to visit a, landmark site of TV history, pop over to 35 Wooddale Lane. The Loud family had 7 members, and Gilbert only met 6 of them that first night. There was Bill, who was the father. He was 50 years old at the start of filming. Pat, the mother of the family, who really would go on to become a star in her own right for many reasons. She's 45 at the start of filming. The oldest child of the family, Lance, had actually just moved to New York. Basically, right before filming and anything had started. Lance was not at the home living with the family when Gilbert met them. And Lance actually turned 20 years old right around the beginning of filming. For the timeline here, Gilbert had been hunting since the beginning of 1971, literally in January, and he met them, I believe, May or April. Filming started in June of that year. Kevin, who was 18 during filming, Grant, who was 17, Delilah, who was 15, and Michelle, who was 13. Parents, 5 kids. One of those kids was out of the house doing his own thing. We'll talk more about Lance later because he's kind of an icon. And so not only do you have a fairly large family, but you've got, some good ages, and everything kind of seems perfect. They're a middle-class family. They have a nice home. There's nice work. Pat, the mother of the family, was a housewife. Bill was the breadwinner. He had a job. He owned his company, really. Was making enough money for them. Middle class, they're set up well. Gilbert saw Pat's position as a housewife as very crucial for the setup and the success of this show. Like I said previously, he wanted to find a family that he could capture the truth behind American families, but he didn't want one that was going to stir up controversy just by existing. He wanted to play it a little safe just to make sure his show would even see the light of day. And so Pat being a housewife was very important and significant here. A sociologist, Carl Zweig, actually points out in a book he wrote in 1970 that the wives of middle-class professional men occupy a particularly questionable position. They're well-educated and highly intelligent, but they're forced in a position which they cannot do any real work or assume any real independence. And then when their children grow up, they are left with empty lives, and often there are divorces. And so that's a little foreshadowing for what will happen later. As the show, you will find out when I cover what happens during filming and what happens in the show really does kind of become about Pat. It is Pat's story within her American family. Gilbert met the family. He loved what he saw. After some quick chats, they agreed very quickly to being a part of this project and agreeing to be filmed for most of their day. I think filming was from 8 to 10 every day. Basically just around them, in their home, at school, wherever they were traveling, anywhere. They had at least Alan and Susan, the film and audio duo that helped Gilbert with his Christy Brown documentary, along for the ride. Filming began pretty quickly, right after meeting the family. There were some trials and tribulations in dealing with the company and funding. Alan Raymond specifically is apparently known for being just difficult, and it took approximately 2 months of negotiations just to get all of the payment worked out between everyone who was involved with this show. By then, they had already filmed a month and a half of footage. The very first footage made for the entire series was actually Pat, the mother of the family, going to visit Lance in New York. Lance had moved to New York. He was staying at the Chelsea Hotel. Now is a good time to get into Lance, I suppose. Lance is often credited as being the first consistently gay character on a television program. Which you may say, wow, Walker, that was a really weird way to phrase that sentence, seeing as Lance Loud is a real person and not a character. And by this I mean he was consistently on the program and no one was making any concession of the fact that he was gay. Like Gilbert and the Raymonds and anyone at the station, no one was trying to cover up that he was gay. And so that's why it's often said that he's he is the first consistently gay character on TV. Even though, yes, in reality, you probably wouldn't call someone a character. Because of this, Lance actually became a bit of a gay icon in his own right. As a result of this show, he really took this and went up to stardom, kind of like his mother. They're very similar. But Lance was living at the Chelsea Hotel. Interestingly enough, he was living there with Holly Woodlawn. There's your homework for the week, is go learn about queer history and Holly Woodlawn, if you don't know who she is. So the very first footage was Pat's trip to New York to see Lance, and also see New York, really. There's not much of this show that can actually be watched. It seems to have been scrubbed from all kinds of media repositories. At least I couldn't find it. There's another podcast that also does history of reality TV, and on their episode about An American Family, they also mentioned that there's really no way to watch this show. There are a few clips floating out there that may be like 4 minutes long from various episodes, but you can't really watch all of it. Now, I will say, though, one of those clips is a 4 to 5 minute argument discussion between Pat and Lance during this very first part of filming. In the show, this is actually the second episode that airs, and we'll get into that when I cover the summary of the show. It's a very interesting scene to watch, especially from kind of a well-cultured reality TV consumer perspective. In total, over 300 hours of footage was shot, and then it was all edited down into 12 one-hour episodes. Gilbert actually initially wanted 15, but, higher up said, no, we're only going to do 12, which is wild to me. Imagine being followed around by cameras. They're watching everything. Although you do have your privacy, one of the rules that was put into place was that a camera would never go through a closed door. So if anyone in the family ever wanted to not be filmed, have a private moment to themselves, all they had to do was go into a room and close the door. They would not be followed. And that's true from what I've read. But imagine you're being followed from 8 to 10 every day by a film crew. They're catching everything. You get fairly used to them pretty quickly, especially when it's a small film crew. And they're people you can actually get along with. And they film over 300 hours of your life across 7 months, June to December, in this case. And then it gets taken down to 12 hours. Imagine if you had to record 1 hour of your life every single day. And it can be anything you want, but 1 hour gets recorded. And then, for a whole year, so you have 365 hours of footage. And then, you get to pick 12 hours to show someone. And say, this is representative of my life. This is me. This is what I do. This is who I am. These are my opinions. These are my actions. This is how I live. This is me as a person. What would you pick? Do you pick the eventful things? Or do you just pick 12 hours of the most boring parts of that year that you can? What would you have even filmed in the first place if you only get 1 hour a day? Do you film something thinking it's going to be the exciting event and hoping that something else exciting doesn't happen later on that day? How do you do that? Now imagine that you don't even get that ability. You're going to be filmed for an hour every day, but you don't get to pick what gets shown anymore. How worried would you be about the image that gets shown to all of America? I'd be a little concerned. And the Louds had these concerns, but they really only actually expressed them not in the first meeting with Gilbert on that night after the drunken drive. There was kind of a practice run done at a party that the Louds held for their oldest, who was predicting a win for some student council, class president kind of position in his high school. And Gilbert brought himself and some cameras, not Alan and Susan. Actually, he just found like a local film crew to help him out with that one night. There was no film in the cameras. They weren't recording that evening, but Gilbert wanted them to practice having cameras around and getting the feel of it before they started diving into filming. And at this party, it is noted by Gilbert and then by Rolf again in his book about the creation of this show, that there was some underage drinking going on. Bill and Pat didn't really seem to mind. And so a little bit after the party had started and was going on, that's when Bill and Pat actually started expressing concern about who gets to choose what happens? Are we going to get any privacy? And like I said, this is when the closed door rule was put into effect, and Gilbert had said, we're making a documentary here, and we're doing it in the cinema verite style, which basically just means we're filming everything. And at the very end, we'll go back in and edit it down into, the 15 hours that Gilbert wanted and 12 hours that it became. And so the Louds, of course, were a little concerned about, who gets to choose what gets edited out, who gets to choose what gets to stay in. And Gilbert had assured them that while he and his editors will be choosing what gets to stay in and what gets cut out, it will always be pre-screened for the Loud family before it gets turned into, national broadcast television. Which suffice them for the time being, but keep this little tidbit in mind for later. Now let's get into the actual show. What happened, what was filmed, and what happened over these 12 episodes. What did the American public actually watch on their TVs? So the very first episode starts actually with a narration by Gilbert, and it starts at the end. So filming started in June 1971, and it ended New Year's 1971 into 1972. The first thing that is shown in episode 1 is actually the family celebrating New Year's Eve. But, spoiler alert, Bill isn't actually celebrating with them. One of the hallmarks of this series, and one of the things that kind of cements it as a very important piece of media, is that not only, is it a historical representation of middle-class life in the 1970s, it also captured a divorce happening in real time and then put it on TV. And it's like a real divorce. And so we start at the end showing Pat celebrating with the kids, and Bill's off by himself, I believe with some girlfriend. And so the first part of this first episode is this New Year's Eve party, although you can tell the family's kind of like, Bill's not here. Pat's a little over it. And Gilbert's narrating, telling us that, this is the end of the story. But how did we get here? And so then the second half of the first episode, or more the second and thirds of the episode, cuts back to the beginning of filming. Or not so much the beginning of filming exactly, because as I said, the very first thing filmed was Pat's trip to New York. It cuts back and shows vignettes of the different members of the family to kind of introduce them to the audience. And these scenes are actually taken from various parts of filming, as early as June and as far forward as September, when school starts for the younger kids. Gilbert is actually narrating over this, like I said, and I like this quote from him to kind of introduce the show and introduce the family. The Louds are neither average nor typical. No family is. They are not the American family. They are simply an American family. Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen, dropping the title of the show. I wish I could find a recording of either this narration or even the kind of title card of the show. I found pictures, but I really wish I could find a video, and it's just not out there as far as I know. Like I said, the clips you can even find are very minimal. And so most of the episode synopses that I'm going to kind of relay to you, I actually had to get from researching just what other people have summarized for me. Bless the people of the internet that have done this research ahead of me. So the very first footage was Pat's trip to New York to see Lance, and also see New York, really. There's not much of this show that can actually be watched. It seems to have been scrubbed from all kinds of media repositories. At least I couldn't find it. There's another podcast that also does history of reality TV, and on their episode about An American Family, they also mentioned that there's really no way to watch this show. There are a few clips floating out there that may be 4 minutes long from various episodes, but you can't really watch all of it. Now, I will say, though, one of those clips is a 4 to 5 minute argument discussion between Pat and Lance during this very first part of filming. In the show, this is actually the second episode that airs, and we'll get into that when I cover the summary of the show. It's a very interesting scene to watch, especially from kind of a well-cultured reality TV consumer perspective. In total, over 300 hours of footage was shot, and then it was all edited down into 12 one-hour episodes. Gilbert actually initially wanted 15, but, higher up said, no, we're only going to do 12, which is wild to me. Imagine being followed around by cameras. They're watching everything. Although you do have your privacy, one of the rules that was put into place was that a camera would never go through a closed door. So if anyone in the family ever wanted to not be filmed, have a private moment to themselves, all they had to do was go into a room and close the door. They would not be followed. And that's true from what I've read. But imagine you're being followed from 8 to 10 every day by a film crew. They're catching everything. You get fairly used to them pretty quickly, especially when it's a small film crew. And they're people you can actually get along with. And they film over 300 hours of your life across 7 months, June to December, in this case. And then it gets taken down to 12 hours. Imagine if you had to record 1 hour of your life every single day. And it can be anything you want, but 1 hour gets recorded. And then, for a whole year, so you have 365 hours of footage. And then you get to pick 12 hours to show someone and say, this is representative of my life. This is me. This is what I do. This is who I am. These are my opinions. These are my actions. This is how I live. This is me as a person. What would you pick? Do you pick the eventful things? Or do you just pick 12 hours of the most boring parts of that year that you can? What would you have even filmed in the first place if you only get 1 hour a day? Do you film something thinking it's going to be the exciting event and hoping that something else exciting doesn't happen later on that day? How do you do that? Now imagine that you don't even get that ability. You're going to be filmed for an hour every day, but you don't get to pick what gets shown anymore. How worried would you be about the image that gets shown to all of America? I'd be a little concerned. And the Louds had these concerns, but they really only actually expressed them not in the first meeting with Gilbert on that night after the drunken drive. There was kind of a practice run done at a party that the Louds held for their oldest, who was predicting a win for some student council, class president kind of position in his high school. And Gilbert brought himself and some cameras, not Alan and Susan. Actually, he just found a local film crew to help him out with that one night. There was no film in the cameras. They weren't recording that evening, but Gilbert wanted them to practice having cameras around and getting the feel of it before they started diving into filming. And at this party, it is noted by Gilbert and then by Rolf again in his book about the creation of this show that there was some underage drinking going on. Bill and Pat didn't really seem to mind. And so a little bit after the party had started and was going on, that's when Bill and Pat actually started expressing concern about who gets to choose what happens? Are we going to get any privacy? And like I said, this is when the closed door rule was put into effect, and Gilbert had said, we're making a documentary here, and we're doing it in the cinema verite style, which basically just means we're filming everything. And at the very end, we'll go back in and edit it down into, the 15 hours that Gilbert wanted and 12 hours that it became. And so the Louds, of course, were a little concerned about, who gets to choose what gets edited out, who gets to choose what gets to stay in. And Gilbert had assured them that while he and his editors will be choosing what gets to stay in and what gets cut out, it will always be pre-screened for the Loud family before it gets turned into, national broadcast television. Which suffice them for the time being, but keep this little tidbit in mind for later. Now let's get into the actual show. What happened, what was filmed, and what happened over these 12 episodes. What did the American public actually watch on their TVs? So the very first episode starts actually with a narration by Gilbert, and it starts at the end. So filming started in June 1971, and it ended New Year's 1971 into 1972. The first thing that is shown in episode 1 is actually the family celebrating New Year's Eve. But, spoiler alert, Bill isn't actually celebrating with them. One of the hallmarks of this series, and one of the things that kind of cements it as a very important piece of media, is that not only, is it a historical representation of middle-class life in the 1970s, it also captured a divorce happening in real time and then put it on TV. And it's like a real divorce. And so we start at the end showing Pat celebrating with the kids, and Bill's off by himself, I believe with some girlfriend. And so the first part of this first episode is this New Year's Eve party, although you can tell the family's kind of like, Bill's not here. Pat's a little over it. And Gilbert's narrating, telling us that, this is the end of the story. But how did we get here? And so then the second half of the first episode, or more the second and thirds of the episode, cuts back to the beginning of filming. Or not so much the beginning of filming exactly, because as I said, the very first thing filmed was Pat's trip to New York. It cuts back and shows vignettes of the different members of the family to kind of introduce them to the audience. And these scenes are actually taken from various parts of filming, as early as June and as far forward as September, when school starts for the younger kids. Gilbert is actually narrating over this, like I said, and I like this quote from him to kind of introduce the show and introduce the family. The Louds are neither average nor typical. No family is. They are not the American family. They are simply an American family. Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen, dropping the title of the show. I wish I could find a recording of either this narration or even the kind of title card of the show. I found pictures, but I really wish I could find a video, and it's just not out there as far as I know. Like I said, the clips you can even find are very minimal. And so most of the episode synopses that I'm going to kind of relay to you, I actually had to get from researching just what other people have summarized for me. Bless the people of the internet that have done this research ahead of me. So how was this show received? Well, firstly, I should say, Craig Gilbert thought it was a success right after filming. It took them a long time to edit all the 300 hours of footage down to 12 hours, but he thought what he had captured and what he had produced was exactly what he had set out to do, and he thought it would be great. He was really hoping that when people watched this series, they would be able to look at it and reflect upon their own lives and go, oh wow, I really see myself in that family in some aspect. Keep in mind they are a white middle-class family from Santa Barbara, California, so I don't know how well that came across, but regardless, that was his goal, and he was really hoping that this kind of reflection and connection that he wanted people to make would happen, and that connection and reflection would override most of the criticism and the negativity that the show experienced or conjured up in its audience and critics. The series drew over 10 million viewers, but also drew considerable controversy. we just watched them have a divorce, and it was broadcast to the entire country, along with little, minor problems as well. You can be assured that Lance being gay was not received well by a lot of the, viewers around the country. The family was actually featured in a Newsweek article in March of that year. The show started airing on January 11th of 1973, and the last episode aired on March 29th of that year. This article came out on March 12th, so the show hadn't finished airing yet. I believe 12 would put it just after Pat asks for the divorce, and the article is just called The Broken Family, so you can imagine how that went. There was a lot of criticism received regarding this show, and a lot of it had to do with the nature of how the show was made, which I wasn't expecting those arguments to come up this early in kind of the history of reality TV at all. We kind of, with a lot of shows today, you can tell, if you've watched a lot of reality TV, you can tell what is truly happening, in real time for the first time, and what is genuinely being captured, versus what is being asked of people on these shows to, can you say that again one more time? Or can we put these two people together to have them fight, just see what happens, in the sense that it's like real things are happening, but they're being constructed, or they're being provoked, or, inspired in some way. And so a lot of the critics of this series, including the Loud family, were really like, well, how can you be sure that what you captured was, their genuine family life at all? How do you know they're not playing it up for the cameras or whatnot? To which Gilbert, had a defense. He was saying, well, we captured all of this footage. Eventually, yes, it's weird at the beginning to have cameras around you all the time, but eventually you're going to get used to it. And you're going to go back to living exactly the way you were. And that is true. The kids of the family, in some interviews and some both verbal, recorded interviews that I've been able to watch, and written interviews, have said that to them, the Raymonds that helped make the show were just as much as a family. Same with Gilbert. They're around them so often, they got so used to them, that having the cameras and having them there was not an issue. But still, critics are going to say, well, how can we really know that the Loud family isn't just acting for the camera? That this wasn't all put on? Of course, that wasn't the only criticism to come out of this. It was just the method of documentary that was being employed here. But also, Craig's entire thesis statement, if you will. He filmed this family because he wanted to capture what was happening in just American family life. And it was a divorce. It was a rough times. A lot of American families did not appreciate that. How can this be the American family? Especially when, as you consider, they are a white middle-class family from California. And some critics and some viewers, have written about this as well. And it's like, well, this isn't my American family. I'm poor, or I'm black, or I live in Missouri. This isn't my American family, which is a valid criticism. But I will say at the same time, there are many people who wrote positively about the show for that exact same point. Is they saw themselves in that family, or they could see that their family wasn't exactly the same, but this is what other families are like. And so it was a, useful and educational experience for them. Something good for them to watch. It still drew over 10 million viewers, so obviously it was, at the very least, entertaining, if not in each episode individually. The entire idea was entertaining to many people. After the show had started airing, there were obviously the Loud family started to become celebrities because they're on the first reality TV show. There were book deals, there were interviews with TV talk show hosts and everything. And one interview that I actually got to watch, and this is some of the only footage that I could find of any of them, including footage from the show, was on the Dick Cavett show. He interviewed the family in February of 1973. So a few episodes have come out by now because the show first aired on the 11th of January. And so during one part, he actually talked with all the children about what they thought about their own appearances in the series. And I love how, first of all, this is in the 70s and Lance is dressed like he's in the 80s, so trendsetter, generations ahead of yesterday. But the kids kind of have a consensus of about like, oh, it was very, strange to watch yourself and realize how you looked in the footage after the fact. Kevin was a little bit more self-reflective, and he's like, he was very disappointed, but he also realized that you're kind of critical of yourself on TV. Everyone else is also critical of you on TV. Delilah, I love this quote from her, that she was sitting there and she says, I felt pressed for something to say sometimes. She goes, I'm looking at myself, and she says, say something intelligent. Don't just sit there. Which is a great quote, and I think we should all take that into our own lives. Say something intelligent. Don't just sit there. Interestingly enough, Margaret Mead, the anthropologist that Gilbert had made a documentary about back in 1968, actually contributed a quote to TV Guide right before the show aired, because she was a very strong supporter of this idea and the show. She was an anthropologist. Of course she's going to love this idea. It's sociological research. She says, the show is, I believe, as new and significant as the invention of drama or the novel. A new way in which people can learn to look at life by seeing the real life of others interpreted by the camera. Which are some very strong words, and I happen to agree with those words, but I'm also a big fan of reality TV, and that's why I love it, because I get to see, a new way of looking at life through a camera. Pat Loud, mother of the family, really the focus of the show, especially in the second half, really did not agree with Margaret. Pat was like, that's very nice. I don't believe that at all. What's the legacy of this show? Well, as I've said many times, this show really is the first reality TV show that's out there. Nothing had really been done of this kind on the TV format. Documentaries had been made for a while, especially using the technique that Gilbert did of just filming everything as it happens and then seeing what you can produce from the footage at the end. With minimal interaction of anything that's going on. By which I mean, the Loud family is never, speaking to the camera. We're not getting what we would later call a confessional or an interview part. It's just them living their lives. And so that obviously is going to be a very significant impact on, how we make TV, media, and it really, created this entire genre of television that is about to explode with all sorts of different ideas and branches. This show is what we would call a documentary style reality TV show. We'll get into a bunch more as we go through the history of the genre. It's specifically directly inspired, I don't want to say a clone, but it inspired an imitation, in a good way, called The Family, that was made over in the UK, that took a similar approach but had a lot of things that were different. Notably, I can still watch that show. Unlike you can't really watch An American Family anywhere. Pat Loud, the mother, published an autobiography in 1974. So a year after the show aired. Like I said, book deals, TV show deals, anything. Called Pat Loud, A Woman's Story. 10 years after the show aired, HBO broadcast a special called An American Family Revisited, The Louds 10 Years Later. Which, meant back up with the Louds. I believe that series also had extra footage that the Raymonds had shot that wasn't used in the original airing of the show. I could be wrong. I know that eventually the Raymonds had extra footage that they released to the public. Which, can't find that either. Surprise. In 2003, PBS broadcast the film Lance Loud, A Death in an American Family. Lance, as I'd mentioned before, kind of went on to just become a gay icon. He'd lived with Holly Woodlawn. He was one of the, kind of inspiring media figures for a lot of young gays and older gays when the show came out. He went on to do all these things. He was an activist. He was kind of a musician. He was friends with Andy Warhol. Pat tells a story after the show ends and the family's divorced. Bill stays in California and the rest of the family moves to New York. And they actually live with Lance for a while before they kind of get their own, like, living situation figured out. Pat tells a story at one point where she picks up the phone and it's Andy Warhol. And he's like, "Where's Lance?" And she's like, "He's not here." So Lance really kind of, Pat took the show's controversy and just kind of the publicity and turned it into a book and became a very prolific figure. And Lance really took it in the same way and pushed himself into kind of his own celebrity status within the gay world. However, Lance Loud passed away in December of 2001 due to HIV-complicated hepatitis, and that's when PBS released, or they had filmed and then released in 2003, Lance Loud, A Death in an American Family, which is all about Lance, and it actually brought the family back together for the filming and then release of that kind of film. In 2011, we're not done yet. In 2011, HBO has another film that comes out called Cinema Verite, which was the filmmaking technique that Craig Gilbert used to make this show. This is a film which is a fictionalized account of the process of making An American Family. So now we have a film about making a reality TV show about a family. It's fictionalized, though. James Gandolfini plays Craig Gilbert, which is interesting casting if you ever see pictures of either of them. It's good casting. The point I brought up earlier about Candy Darling potentially being present, but I'm not sure. Willem from RuPaul's Drag Race Season 4 and, other wonderful escapades that Willem does, plays Candy Darling in this movie. There's an interesting, cameo there. But the movie was all about how An American Family was made, and it's fictionalized, and it kind of, takes a dramatic spin on it, in the sense that there's a lot of scenes where things are being portrayed as Craig Gilbert pressured the family, specifically Pat, to film certain things a certain way or participate in a certain way. Most of this comes down to the divorce, which Craig, in his reflection, says that the brother and the sister-in-law helped Pat decide to film the divorce. They were kind of the final say. Craig just said it would be really good to have it on film. And in this movie that was on HBO, it was very much like the story being told is that Craig is forcing Pat to record the divorce and have everything on film. A little bit of controversy there. Craig himself had really high hopes, once the project was actually made and everything was filmed. He had really high hopes for the success of An American Family, to the point that he was so taken back by the extreme negative criticism that he received, not only from just TV critics, but also from the Loud family. They really turned on him, and painted him as this, he promised us all these things and they weren't delivered, or he said it would be this way and it turned out to be this way. He had bad intentions coming in and filming us. We didn't know what we were doing the project for, etc. All of this, criticism and negative press and attacks on him really pushed him into kind of, becoming a hermit of in a sense. He just did not produce much more work after An American Family because of all this negative attention on him. Craig Gilbert actually passed away in 2020. Bill Loud passed away in 2018, and Pat passed away early this year, 2021. As I mentioned already, Lance Loud passed away in 2001. Grant, Kevin, Michelle, and Delilah are all still alive and working various jobs. Grant and Delilah have both worked in some kind of media, so TV or producing or interviewing, something like that, advertising. Kevin has worked in finance, which If you watch the show and you hear like what Bill has to say about his kids, Kevin's kind of the successful one. And Michelle ended up working in fashion for a while. So that is the story of An American Family, the show that many consider to be the first true reality television show created and aired. You can kind of already see what we know reality TV as today already having its roots in this show. The criticism that gets, thrown at the show, that is often thrown at shows today and in between. Production style, how it was filmed, the kind of people that get on reality TV. There's a interesting academic piece that I did not read, but I found, that is all about, who gets to be on reality TV? Who gets to be chosen as, quote, normal or representative of real life and gets to be on TV? One interesting question that comes from thinking about this show and thinking about how it was conceptualized and created and filmed and what was actually filmed and the criticism is that, is it even possible to make a documentary of real life? A lot of the critics of the show tried to bring science into this, which I thought was really funny as a ex-chemist myself. They tried to bring in a kind of quantum observation sentiment into how documentary style show works, and they're like, oh, well, because you're observing the family, they're not going to react and act as they would naturally. The act of recording and observing them is making them be different than who they are. And we'll see if that holds true as we go forward. I'm not going to share my opinion quite yet on that regard. I think I'll let it percolate and see how it develops as we look at different kinds of shows. This show was the documentary style, but as we go forward, we'll explore talent search shows like American Idol, or competition shows like Survivor, and everything in between. You've got My Strange Addiction, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, Big Brother, all these different shows. Ice Road Truckers is a reality show, but they all branched out from this show, which I think is very cool. That is it for this installment of the recap episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you come back for more. You can also follow the pod on Twitter and Instagram at The Recap Episode for updates, additional content, and to talk with me about any and all things reality TV. Thanks for listening, and when you need to learn about the reality you've missed, you can always check out The Recap Episode.